Thank you, Professor Steve Payson, Arira Chika, and the Society of Government Economists for organizing this exciting panel on the use of data analytics and data science in policy analysis. And today I want to speak a bit about my research on funding climate justice, and in particularly focus on taxation transfers and green bonds. And we all can kind of agree that climate change is happening, especially when you look here at the world surface temperature anomalies from 1891 on, recorded until 2021. We see this definite upwards trend. And my research in particularly focuses on the disparate impact of climate change in order to highlight differences, how climate change impacts the world in economic terms, in order to argue for climate justice redistribution in taxation and bonds. So first I created this index in which I calculate the country temperature differences, GDP composition per country by the three sectors of agriculture, service, and industry sector. And then there is this top temperature for productivity per GDP sector. And when you factor these three variables together, the country differences in temperature, the GDP composition differences, and the different top temperatures per GDP composition, we can see here in this graph that I created out of the index that the greener the country, the more time the country has ahead until they reach economic peak conditions in light of climate change. And we see the red countries around the equator belt will have run out of favorable time the first. When I then plot 1/3 of the countries that have time ahead, in 100 years, 1/3 of the countries that have run out of favorable temperature conditions the first. When I plot this here in this bar chart, so the greener countries would be 1/3 of all countries looking ahead, and the red countries would be the countries that will run out of time the first. When I then plotted in the second on the right side on this, the chart, bar chart, when I plot only 1/3 of the economic gains prospected from climate change, you see this green bar shifts up. So only a few countries will be gaining a lot from climate change expected in the next 100 years in economic terms, when you factor in the different GDP compositions and the ground temperature and the top temperature for productivity. In order to drive this climate injustice point further, we can already now see that the greenhouse gas emissions come out of these countries, or there's a positive, significant positive correlation between being a climate winner and emitting greenhouse gas emissions, but we also already now see that there are climate-induced migration patterns into countries that have the longest prospect of economic prosperity under climate change, and we see financial inflows in those countries. So there is this huge inequality in the disparate impact of climate change on the Earth. And we see climate-induced migration and financial inflows already in these countries that are also causing climate change. And all of this leads to redistribution mandates. We can also trace this in Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative that says to step away from the position that one will have and to only engage into actions that someone wants to have incurred onto them. Hans Jonas then applied it on the environmental domain. John Rawls also speaks about the veil of ignorance to analyze every ethical predicament behind a veil of ignorance, whether or not one gains or loses from the predicament. Nicholas Kaldor's redistribution compensation criteria can be applied, but also Dimitri Nikolin speaks about this ethical obligation in terms of climate responsibility. first, in order to address redistribution patterns, I only drew at this map where I show the GDP prospects per inhabitant. And the greener the country, the more the single inhabitant of that country has time ahead of economic productivity under climate change. And the red and the yellow countries will be running out of time the first. But there are heavy political implications of the North having to fund the equator belt. And in order to really show the different sides of climate justice, I then embarked on calculating 9 different indices in order to not only factor in the geo-impact of climate change, but also the the resilience finance opportunities of countries, what countries are better in finding a financial solution for a common problem. And also I factor in what I call finance diplomacy, countries that are well established in terms of trade that could enact a climate justice redistribution solution very quickly, and that also have a higher responsibility to act on climate change. So in the first set of 3 indices, I show the geo-impact of climate change. In the first index, I factor in these economic gains and loss prospects and CO2 emissions per country. Here we see that the red and the yellow and the lighter green countries are climate winners and have higher CO2 emissions, so have a higher obligation to redistribute some of the gains into the losing areas, which are the darker green colored countries. In my second index, I also factor in the climate flexibility, which is calculated based on the temperature range a country enjoys. So this is argued as a future wealth of nations in terms of trade assets. The more climate zones and climate flexibility a country has, the more potentially this country can offer and has therefore a better economic prospect. And here you see again the red and the yellow and the light green countries. They emit the most, have the highest gain prospects, and also are the most climate flexible territories on the earth. And then I argue they should also be having this higher responsibility to act on climate change. And in the third geo-impact index, I also think about CO2 emission changes. And here you see the US shifts from being a country that has a responsibility to act on climate change and redistribute some of the funds potentially enacted via a green taxation into a country that should gain funds, and this gaining funds is based on the CO2 emission changes. I took here the year 2019, and in that year the US had stark CO2 emission drops. So a reduction of CO2 emissions could be used as an incentive over time for countries to really shift from one position being a climate change funder or a mitigation funder into a country that receives from a common climate bond funds for a positive change in CO2 emissions. The second set of indices, I first calculated what I call the Financial Crisis Intervention Index, and I took beautiful data from Yale University, the metric Schmelzig database that has a historical account of financial crisis intervention by country. And I took the data from 1960 to 2019, and I calculated together how much a country had guarantees, lendings, capital injection, resolutions, rules, asset management, and other means to combat crises with financial means. And this, I argue, gives a higher responsibility to act on climate change and really act fast around the globe and in releasing funds in order to redistribute to areas that are losing out the most, and which are the green countries. So we see countries in red and yellow and light green again should be redistributing funds into the darker green areas. Then I also use this resilience finance index, in which I only integrated from the metric Schmelzing database guarantees lending and capital injection. And here again, the red countries and the light green countries should be funding and mitigating climate change with releasing funds into the greener areas, because they have already historical knowledge and access to capital. In order to address access to capital in particular, I also created another index that factors in the bank lending rates around the world. And here we see again China and the US, but also Russia have excellent conditions to gain funds around the world, and therefore should be facing a higher responsibility to act on climate change and help the world in redistributing some of the gains of a warming globe into areas that are losing out the most and the fastest, colored in dark green. And in the very last set of indices, I factor in what I call finance diplomacy. So what countries have are well established and can move capital very quickly around the globe due to diplomacy ties and previous actions on the financial means. So first, in order to address the economic integration, I factor out what countries are actually producing CO2 that they are not consuming. Those would be countries that produce a lot of goods and thereby emit, but then the goods are exported to other areas. And here we see the dominance of China really disappears. So China is emitting CO2, greenhouse gas emissions are very high in China, but then Chinese consumption of greenhouse gases in the goods is not very high because most of the goods are exported and consumed somewhere else. And here we see a small little country in Europe, Switzerland, but also the lighter yellow countries in Europe are actually consuming a lot of goods that are produced somewhere else where the greenhouse gases are emitted. So that would factor in consumption-based trade adjusted CO2 emissions. And then in my next index, I also factor in what countries have really good diplomatic ties and practice science diplomacy for a long time. This is a term that is used in order to address countries that have scientific networks on the international globe, and really step away from political denominations in order to combat large-scale crises. And these countries, I argue, have a high responsibility to act fast in the redistribution of climate gains. This index that I created on science diplomacy factors in academic quotas, institutions, and diplomacy. And here you see the importance of the US and Russia, especially at this crucial moment in time. It's important that networks maintain active, that combat large-scale crises and not get lost in the political agenda of the day. And in the very last index, I also factor in the global economic connectivity based on trade, remittances, foreign direct investments, and migration patterns. And here you see small European countries like Luxembourg, Switzerland, but also Hungary are actually very economically connected and can move capital very quickly around the world. So those countries also have best starting grounds and therefore potentially a higher responsibility to help the world in this redistribution of expected economic climate change gains around the globe before it is too late. And with this, I really thank the audience for allowing me to speak today. And I would really love to debrief these findings with the Society of Government Economists today.